We spend roughly a third of our lives asleep, more time than we'll devote to anything else. And yet, most of us don't realize what sleep is doing or why it feels so strange when it doesn't go as planned. This short video is not a breakdown of how to sleep better or a decoding of dream symbolism, but more of a brief look at what sleep is, what happens when it begins to unravel, and why those moments of fog, paralysis, or strange emotional clarity might not be glitches at all, but just part of how the brain functions when we stop being conscious. There's this persistent idea in books, in pop psychology, in quiet late night conversations that dreams are inherently meaningful, that they're trying to show us something important if only we could interpret the code. And yet, in practice, dreams tend to dissolve the moment we wake. They shift settings without warning, involve people who we haven't spoken to in years, and hold emotional weight that often doesn't correspond to anything concrete. Rather than interpreting them as puzzles to be solved, it's often more useful to understand them as what they are, the output of a brain still working, just no longer concerned with logic, consistency, or self-editing. Although we often focus on dreams because they're what we remember, sleep itself is performing a range of functions that have nothing to do with storylines. During sleep, and particularly during certain phases of it, the brain is clearing out waste proteins, reinforcing neural pathways that help stabilize memory, and regulating hormones tied to mood, appetite, and immune response. If we think of being awake as gathering material, then sleep is the period where everything gets stored, filed, or thrown out, often without our awareness, but never without consequence. Sleep happens in cycles that repeat roughly every 90 minutes, and each cycle passes through multiple stages, from light sleep to slow wave deep sleep, and eventually into REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, which is where most of vivid dreaming occurs. What's important is that these stages aren't evenly distributed throughout the night. Early cycles contain more deep restorative sleep for the body, while REM sleep becomes more dominant in the later hours, especially just before waking. This means that people who sleep in short, irregular stretches often miss the very parts of sleep most essential for emotional and cognitive regulation, even if they technically log enough hours. What makes REM sleep particularly strange is that during this phase, certain parts of the brain, like the visual cortex and the amygdala, which is involved in emotion, remain highly active, while others, like the prefrontal cortex, which handles logic and decision making, become significantly less engaged. This combination creates a kind of mental space where emotion and imagery continue to fire, but without the consequences or constraints of time, structure, which is why dreams can feel so convincing while they're happening and so nonsensical just a few minutes later. It's not that the brain is confused, it's just that it's no longer applying the rules it uses while we're awake. So, this imbalance is also why, when a dream feels meaningful or intense, it's difficult to explain or hold onto afterwards. Not because it wasn't real in some way, but because the parts of the brain that encode clarity and sequence weren't leading the process. What we remember, if anything, are fragments, a sentence, a mood, an image that doesn't connect to anything but still lingers for hours. And perhaps that's the point, not to generate a clear narrative, but to give the brain a space in which it can move more freely through unresolved content without needing to explain itself. Of course, not all experiences that happen in sleep feel safe or abstract. Sleep paralysis, for instance, occurs when the mind wakes before the body has finished exiting REM, which means a person becomes aware while still physically immobilized, and in some cases, still half entangled in a dream state. Because REM sleep includes muscular atonia, which is the body's way of preventing us from acting out our dreams, People in this state often find themselves conscious but unable to move, and occasionally still experiencing visual or auditory hallucinations. It's uncomfortable and sometimes frightening, but not dangerous. Just one more reminder that the boundary between sleep and waking isn't always as clean as we'd like it to be. When sleep becomes shallow, fragmented, or consistently shortened, its effects are wide-reaching, often extending into areas we don't immediately associate with rest. Memory becomes less reliable, emotional regulation weakens, and the ability to focus or maintain perspective begins to fade. For some people, this shows up as general fatigue. For others, especially with insomnia, it can become a cycle in which the pressure to sleep makes it harder to relax, which leads to more fragmented sleep, and so on. And because REM sleep tends to dominate the second half of the night, it's often the first to be sacrificed, which means people who are sleep deprived may not be dreaming much at all. Or if they are, the dreams tend to be shorter, more fragmented, and less useful to the brain. It also doesn't help that many of us take screens into bed, telling ourselves it's a way to unwind, even though we know on some level that the light from our phones is disrupting our natural rhythms. Exposure to blue light late in the evening delays melatonin release, shifts our circadian rhythm, and pushes REM sleep later into the night, which often results in lighter, more disrupted sleep overall. So when people say they're sleeping but still wake up tired, this is one of the first places to look. And dreams don't always need to be understood to be important. They are part of a much broader system that allows us to process, regulate, and recover. And sleep is where that system does its best work. We may not have remembered what we dreamed or even feel that we've rested, but that doesn't mean the brain hasn't been busy. So rather than thinking of sleep as something passive or optional, it might be more accurate to think of it as a kind of form of healthy reconstruction, a return to balance if we give it the time. And of course, ideally, this happens at night, not during your sleep and dreams lecture, unless you've made peace with being sprayed in the face with a water gun. Thank you.